Hey, everybody, welcome to Tip of the Spear. And as always, we're bringing you the leading voices in our culture that can weigh in on the issues of the day from a biblical perspective, a prophetic perspective, and also today from a historical, evidential perspective. I am very excited about our show because we're going to be talking to Russ Breault. He's the founder of the Shroud Encounter and the leading expert on the Shroud of Turin. Now, I have personal interest in this. I've been studying the Shroud of Turin for a long time, and to be able to have an expert like Russ here is going to be phenomenal. You're going to be blessed. He's going to present a lot of information. If you don't know Russ, he's the author and speaker and educator, has spent over 30 years of researching and presenting the Shroud's history, the science, and the significance of it. He's appeared in major documentaries, spoken at universities, churches, conferences worldwide. He has the latest book out that you probably need to get. I would encourage you to get it, called The Shroud Encounter, Explore the World's Greatest Unsolved Mystery. And that just came out last year. And so make sure you pick that up. So anyway, let me bring on this show, Russ Breault. Russ, thanks for being with us today and taking some time for us.
Hey, Brandon, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, man. So I am fascinated by the Shroud of Turin. I am thoroughly, I'm already convinced. You're dealing with a believer here, but I want you to be able to unpack this for our audience that may not be familiar with the Shroud of Turin, because I know, because we come from a Protestant background, and the instant idea was, well, this is a Catholic relic. We don't want to get into that, and so a lot of Protestants stayed away. And then we had the issue that came up from the Shroud of Turin. I want you to speak to this about the sample they took. It dated back, the carbon-14 dated back to the Middle Ages, so, it's not legit. But bring us up to speed on the latest evidence, some of the surprising things that have come out since, I think, 2017 about what is it saying? What's the evidence portraying this as?
So let's just look at what the Shroud is.
Okay.
We're talking about a 14-foot long, 3.5-foot wide piece of linen. It's long and narrow, made out of flax, made out of a very complex weave, a 3-to-1 herringbone pattern weave. So it's a very expensive cloth, and it is long enough, certainly long enough, to envelop about a 5'10", maybe even as tall as 6 foot crucified man. The intriguing thing about the Shroud, and has been for centuries, is that it bears the faint front and back image of a bearded crucified man.
Yeah.
And with all of the bloodstains that correlate with the wounds of crucifixion, not just any crucifixion, the crucifixion of Jesus. Because questions I often get is, well, how do you know it's Jesus? Because after all, we don't have the DNA of Jesus to match it up with somebody we might extract from the Shroud, so you can't prove it, complete 100%. We could certainly do a forensic analysis. And so when you look at it that way, we have 30 puncture wounds around the head from an apparent crown of thorns. You have well over 120 scourge marks all over the body from a vicious scourging.
Yeah.
You have nail wounds in the wrist, nail wounds in the feet. Mm-hmm. The legs aren't broken, and there's a wound in the side which occurred after death. And so, and plus the fact you have someone who's crucified, died a criminal's death, yet he's wrapped in a rich man's shroud. That just doesn't happen. In fact, that's even a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. It's Isaiah 53:9 says he made his grave with the wicked and the rich in his death. Yeah. And so you have to establish, what is the Shroud? Why would anyone think it's Jesus? Well, we just went through that. But then we have to understand that this is the most analyzed artifact in the world. Nothing has received as much scientific scrutiny as the Shroud. Yeah. 1978, you had a team of 33 American scientists go to Turin they have hands-on access to the cloth for 5 days, working in shifts round the clock, 120 hours, and they got all kinds of gear. They have over 70 crates of gear weighing over 10 tons, brought from various laboratories throughout the United States. And
wow.
So that their mission to understand this mystery was simply this: what is the nature of the image? What is the nature of the bloodstains?
Yeah.
Not to try to prove that one thing or another, they just try to understand it from a scientific standpoint. What is the cause of this image?
Yeah.
And they came away saying that it's not the work of an artist. In other words, there's no visible trace of any kind of paint, ink, dye, pigmentation, stain. There are no artistic substances on the cloth to account for the image. But the image is plainly there, and but it's not the result of any substances applied to the cloth by some alleged artist.
Gotcha.
And then you have a whole pattern of bloodstains. Is it just paint? Is it animal blood? Is it blood from actual wounds? Well, yeah, it is. It's blood from actual. It's called the exudate of actual wounds. What we see on the cloth is not whole blood. It's not blood that was painted on by some artist. It's literally, we see blood components, but we do not see whole blood, indicating that this is the actual ooze or the exudate from wounds. Especially telling is a high content in bilirubin, which is a breakdown component of the red blood cells that occurs during conditions of severe stress. And I think crucifixion might qualify. And so you have to understand what the shroud is or what it purports to be. And the fact that in 1981, the scientists all came together and said that it's not the work of an artist. Now we're not and it's which left open the possibility of, well, could it be the shroud of Jesus?
Yeah. And
they left open that clear possibility, because there's this either or proposition with the shroud. And that is this: either it's the authentic Breault shroud of Jesus or it's not. Yeah. And if it's not, well, then what is it? Then it must be the work of an artist. And so then that gets us into the debate over the whole dating issue, because in 1978 you had a whole team of 33 scientists tell us it's not the work of an artist. 10 years later, it's carbon dated and say, hold on, boys, it's dated. It has a date range of 1260 to 1390, so it appears to be medieval. And so it's like, so now what do we do? Because we have a cloth that is not the work of an artist, and yet it's dated to the Middle Ages. And so now we have to say, well, who's wrong and who's right? Yeah. And it's now what happened in the dating is that they were supposed to cut 3 different samples from 3 different locations on the cloth. They didn't do that. They cut one sample from the outside corner edge, exactly where it had been held and handled hundreds of times over the centuries. And what I'm talking about is that literally for centuries they would display it every year, annually, and on usually on May 4th, which was the official feast day of the Holy Shroud, and they would literally hold it up on a platform, holding it by the exact corner of where it was cut for carbon dating. And so if you were looking for the worst possible sample location, you would cut from exactly where they cut that one sample, and cut that one sample into 3 little pieces. Yeah. And as we like to say today, what could go wrong? And and so now there were many people that were questioning the validity of that corner. Is it possible that corner could have been subjected to contamination or some kind of a medieval repair or a reweave? And that appears to be the case, because Ray Rogers, thermal chemist with Los Alamos National Laboratory, he obtains a thread sample from that exact same corner and compares it with a thread from the main body of the shroud, and lo and behold, they're not the same. Yeah. And so he writes up in a peer-reviewed journal in 2005 and says that it doesn't appear that that what they dated is actually material that is fully representative of the shroud. And it's now you were asking me about 2017.
Yeah, because my understanding is a lot of this evidence was withheld by the British Museum, and then I don't know what they did, but somebody pressed them, Freedom of Information Act or whatever, and was able to obtain more evidence that they were withholding, and so it seems like since that happened and they released that information, now we're finding out, just like exactly what you said, that their sample piece was coming off a piece of the cloth that is possibly, well, it was cotton, and the rest of the shroud is made out of flax and linen, and it had a dye on it instead of just natural aging, and it seems like someone had dyed it to match the color of the original shroud, and so all of this was withheld. Tell us what happened in 2017 about the British Museum. What was behind it? Because it sounds like a conspiracy against the shroud being authentic.
Well, that's very possible. You had 3 laboratories in 1988: Arizona, Zurich, and Oxford, and they were coordinated by the British Museum. And so the British Museum collected all the data from the 3 labs, and they submitted that data to Nature, which is a British journal that published the results in 1989, a year later. Okay. But for some reason, the British Museum did not release all of the data. They only released a partial amount of the data. And of course, we've been wondering why they did that. Yeah. We've been requesting that they release all the data for years. We've been making this request. We get stonewalled, and no answer. Yeah. So finally, a French researcher by the name of Tristan Casabianca, he petitions the British Museum as well as the 3 labs under the Freedom of Information Act, a FOIA request, and so they consent to, they have to comply with this request. And so now 2017, he gets access to all of the raw data. Like I've talked to him about this. He has like a stack of papers about this high. Wow. That's just all of their runs and all their data. It was not organized in any way. Just here, have at it, have fun. You can sit in this room. You can't take anything out of here. So so he had to go day after day after day to go to the British Museum to sit in a room and organize all these papers, all this data. Wow. And he finally publishes in a peer-reviewed journal in 2019 in Archaeometry, which interestingly is published by Oxford University. And he was able to show that they deliberately held out certain outliers. You see, in other words, you had dates that were older, dates that were younger. And so why do we have all these different outliers? Because what this was suggesting was that all these, so why did they eliminate all that? Because everyone who publishes in a peer-reviewed journal wants to achieve their coveted 95% confidence factor, that it measures up to some statistical analysis, and so they had to eliminate outliers in order to get to that statistical confidence, and so but what they did was that by having only one sample with all these different outliers suggests then that sample is not homogeneous. In other words, there appears to be either some kind of contamination, maybe some reweave, some different threads. Why are we getting all these outliers?
Right.
And it's and so basically he proved that sample, had they published all of the data, that article would have never been published, and so now we have some newer technology called wide angle X-ray scattering, which measures the amount of natural aging in fibers, flax fibers or cotton or wool or anything,
Yeah.
and they can determine the amount of natural aging and all these other fibers, and they looked at fibers from the shroud and determined that it had far more aging in it for it only to be 700 years, as alleged by the Carbon Labs. And so in fact, the amount of natural aging found in fibers from the shroud is consistent with linen that they tested from Masada that we know is from 1st century.
Yeah.
And so now you have that problem. Well, now who's right and who's wrong? Because they both can't be right. And so so I just think that at this point the carbon dating can just be said to be inconclusive because they botched the sampling protocol. Not only that, but they even botched the results. So I mean, how can you trust them at this point?
Right. Exactly. And so Russ, take us through then. Okay. So now that really sheds light on this whole carbon-14 dating thing, that it's unreliable what they did. But what is the other evidence now? You mentioned that they found one in Masada that matched this linen shroud, that this was a definitely 1st century shroud. What other things that have they found as evidence that point to the 1st century?
Well, I think, there's certainly... there's nothing about the shroud itself that would indicate that it could not be a 1st century linen shroud, used in a Jewish, burial. And okay. And I think it's really interesting that we know that the manufacture of the shroud is very expensive. It's a 3-to-1 herringbone pattern weave. But what does the scripture say? Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man, purchased a fine linen cloth. So
that's right.
So it correlates with something that he would have had the financial means to purchase. There's also evidence of there is pollen evidence that certainly places the shroud in the Middle East. I mean, Dr. Avinoam Danin, he was a leading botanist with the Hebrew University. He'd written 7 books on the flowers of the Holy Land, and his last book was called Botany of the Shroud. He'll tell you he's convinced by just looking at the pollen and some of the off-body flower images that can be seen in high contrast with photography that cloth originated within a 20-mile radius of Jerusalem.
Really?
And
wow.
And then you have limestone particles that are all over the shroud, microscopic limestone particles, and they're of the same exact kind of limestone that is common to the hills and tombs around Jerusalem. And then there's also, it's interesting that there's particles of calcite, which is a common ingredient in road dirt. And they found this calcite, which is an oxidized form of limestone. They found this calcite 3 locations on the nose, on the knees, and on the feet. And of course, what would you expect from someone who walked in sandals and fell under the weight of the cross?
That's right.
And,
totally.
So there are now. They also did an assay of all of the DNA particles that were found from the shroud. They vacuumed the shroud both in 78 and 88, and we got access to some of that dust. Now we're not talking about the DNA of Jesus. We're talking about just when you think that anyone who's ever touched the cloth, technically their DNA is on the cloth. So when you look at all the DNA that we found. And in the most common DNA that we found is from a people group that is right from the Middle East, and they're really? They are the Druze community, and for some reason they must have handled and held this cloth at some time, at some point in its history when it was in the Middle East, and it's. And so you have a lot of interesting data points that would suggest that this cloth originated in the Middle East, and we've done an so I don't think that it's certainly very feasible, and I mean, if I view very likely that the cloth originates right there, probably manufactured in either Syria or Egypt.
Wow, that's amazing. So Russ, help us out. Let's go back to what you're mentioning about the wounds. Let's talk about the forensic evidence from the body, and let's start with from the head wounds, then we'll go down to the hands and the feet, and then the side. And help us understand what's going on, because the Romans had crucified thousands of people, no doubt about that. So crucifixion was very common, but what was uncommon about this individual is that he's wearing a hat, really, of thorns. And this is unlike what we have seen of anybody that has ever been crucified. And we know of only one person, according to the gospel, that was crucified with a crown of thorns. And this is interesting because this crown is not like a ring crown. It seems to indicate it was more of like a cap that was pushed down on the man's head. Can you explain what was going on here?
Sure. Well, that's exactly what we see. We see that there's over 30 puncture wounds to be counted all around the head, on top of the head, and because this bulky clump of thorns would have been jammed onto his head, and the scripture says, and then they mocked him and hailed, and said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" It was a mockery for the man who, and then they put a staff in his right hand, and then they took that staff and struck him on the head again and again to drive those thorns deep into the scalp, and the nerves in your head are so sensitive, and it would have been excruciating pain, and just blood cascading all the way down to all over the face. I mean, and so it's just would have been horrific sight to see, and then but that's in terms of identifying who this man could be, well, that would be exhibit A is because the crown of thorns was a mockery with someone who claimed to be king of the Jews,
right?
And then you also have to understand he's massively scourged. Now, why was he scourged so badly? Because Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, didn't think he was guilty of a crime worthy of capital punishment. He didn't want to kill him. And the first thing he did, he sent him to King Herod, and Herod sent him back. And then he tried to trade Barabbas, and that didn't work. And so finally he has him scourged to within an inch of his life, thinking that when this bloodied hulk of a man came walking back into the courtyard, that maybe they'd say, okay, that's enough. You don't have to kill him. But that's not what happened. So in spite of being brutally scourged, they still wanted him dead. You see, usually you were either scourged and released as a form of punishment, or you were crucified to be executed. Rarely would you be both scourged and crucified, because the Romans, they were brutal. They wanted you to stay alive as long as possible while you're dying. Imagine that. And so, and because of the scourging, that's why when the soldiers came back by late in the afternoon, Jesus had already given up his spirit at around 3, and they probably got to the others who had been crucified around 3:30 or 4. They were still alive, and so what did they do? They took a large wooden mallet and broke the legs of both of the thieves to speed the process of asphyxia, which is the inability to breathe, and then they expire within about 10 minutes, and you could take them down and almost always throw them into a common grave. Where rarely would someone crucified be given an individual burial. And but what does the scripture say? But when they came to Jesus, they noticed that he was already dead. Therefore, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear. Outflowed blood and water. Now, probably not water. Probably maybe if there had been if Jesus had been on the cross, dead for 30 or more minutes, it would have been a collection of blood chest cavity, that begins to separate. And what we see is probably the separation of blood and blood serum. And that's exactly what we see in the side wound is a separation of blood and blood serum, which is indicative that that's a post-mortem wound. And it's a wound that occurred after death. And you can even see how it just kind of oozes out of the side, which is what you would expect if the blood is no longer pumping, the heart's no longer pumping, the blood's no longer circulating, and it's that's what you're going to see every time they moved the body to remove him from the cross. Blood would have oozed out of that side wound, and it's so everything seems to be forensically accurate. I mean, several pathologists have weighed in and said that this appears to be an image of a real human being who died from these wounds. And it's so again, if that's the case, then there really is no mistaken identity.
Yeah, no kidding. Let's talk about the scourging a little bit, because I find it fascinating that, the Jewish people had the 40 lashes and they would do -1, and then the Romans could scourge however long they wanted to. And I think you said the pattern of scourging on him is like 120 whips. At least. Okay, explain the type of scourging that's found on the body, because we see movies, Russ, that depict the scourging of Jesus with a leather whip. What is the evidence on this individual indicate? And is it just simply confined to the back, or where else did they whip him?
Oh, he's scourged there's scourge marks from the base of the neck all the way down to the ankles. You can see scourge marks on the front chest and thighs, and they used what would be known as a Roman flagrum, which has a wooden base with 3 leather thongs that come out with it, tipped with either bits of bone or metal, usually sheep knuckles, and this is designed to cause some serious pain when it hits the. So I mean, there are accounts of people being scourged to death, and it's so it is a brutal thing.
And so, the interesting thing is, all through the Middle Ages, and we have artwork depicted where Christ is crucified through the hand, and we have experimented with cadavers that will not support a human body on the cross. But what do the nail insertions indicate where they were found on the body?
Yeah, you're right. The nail through the palm of the hand here will not hold the weight of a crucified man much more than a couple hours, because it would rip through the fleshy part in between the fingers, and it's the nail had to be in the wrist in order to secure it to the cross, and it's and that's been demonstrated medically using actually it was a French surgeon by the name of Dr. Pierre Barbet. He wrote a landmark book published in 1950 called The Doctor at Calvary, and he actually experimented on cadavers that he had access to, and proved that the nail had to be in the wrist. And it's as gruesome as that may be, it was very informative, and it's
sure.
Sure.
Well, and that's consistent with what we see with the wound marks on this man.
Well, not only that, but when the nail penetrates the wrist, it partially cuts nerves and tendons, and causes the thumbs to jerk into the center of the palm. And at either point where thumbs could be visible, there are no thumbs visible. And so that it also seems to be consistent, anatomically, with it being a genuine crucifixion.
So that that's interesting, because there's no thumbs when you see the man's hands that are crossed over. So here's an interesting thing. I speak about the rigam mortis of the man and the position he's in rigam mortis, particularly his feet, his legs, and it seems to be, I think he has a droop, and he's stuck in that position. And I think a lot of people see that as, well, he's drooped over because that's he's laid on some type of stone pillow in a tomb. But is that a sign of rigor mortis and the position in which this man died?
Yeah, I think that that's accurate because rigor mortis would have set in pretty quickly because of so much blood loss, and it's and so there's a certain rigidity that occurs with all of the muscles, and so he would have been literally in that position of crucifixion. And no doubt when they had to take the arms that were of course nailed above him and probably break rigor mortis, bring those down and tie them off with a strip, to keep them down. But ultimately, I think there's evidence of this apparent stiffness of the body. Yeah.
What about signs of decay? Did they ever find signs of decay with the individual?
No, there's no evidence of any kind of putrefaction to be found on the cloth. So, which is an indicator that if there was a body in that cloth, it wasn't in there for very long.
Yeah.
And it's and so what's interesting is that rigor mortis sets in fairly quickly, and then over the course of about 36 hours, it gradually subsides, and it's and so and of course that's the beginning of when the deterioration would occur, and so I think most scholars believe that Jesus was probably resurrected after about 36 hours.
Yeah, and
it's so I think that's why we don't see it. So
yeah, it's consistent, and the interesting thing. On Saturday, theologically, that was the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and leaven represents sin, and represents, well, he was sinless, so therefore his body would not see decay, as Scriptures indicated. Right. So it seems to parallel with what even the Scriptures are saying about Jesus. I got another question. The image, let's go back to the image, Russ. It seems to be that the image that was projected was not projected with the shroud draped over him. Can you explain why it doesn't appear as if the image is made from it being just like hanging over a body? And plus, we don't see that kind of evidence that the shroud underneath it, that the body is touching the ground, actually. Can you explain how this image, what did it do, this image?
Well, there's, we're getting into a lot of different theories as to how the image could have been formed, and as theories that the cloth was pulled taut, and well, then who did that? Because you're getting into some very, you're moving into the realm of the supernatural, and certainly, were angels involved? I can't speculate, but I know, that when Mary Magdalene and the two other women arrived at the tomb Sunday morning, they all saw angels standing there, and it's so I don't know if they were, we know from Matthew it was an angel who rolled the stone aside from the entrance, and so we don't know the extent of angelic involvement. And it's too speculative for me to even to go there. Yeah. My preferred theory that I like, and again, not that this has been tested in a laboratory, because you can't replicate a resurrection,
right?
But I like what Dr. John Jackson, theoretical physicist, he was the leader of the Shroud Project, and he calls it the collapse theory. So here the body is lying on this stone slab. Okay. And it's draped with this cloth. Okay. And at some point, Jesus converts to a volume of light, because light has no mass. Yeah. It's just pure energy, pure light. And then as that had now, this is happening like within a split second. Okay. And then the cloth begins to descend through the body to about a depth of 8 millimeters, and then boom, gone.
Wow.
And it's and that would explain some of the feel like the large hollow orbits of the eyes, some of the teeth structure, the long fingers. Maybe you're getting some skeletal structure here,
Yeah.
actually, that's in the palm of the hand, and it's so it might explain some things that way, and certainly doesn't explain everything, but I think that. And then you had the research that was done by physicists Apollo Dell'Orazio. I can never say his last name right. He's an Italian physicist. He's done some great. Dell'Orazio, I think. Anyways, he's done some great work, and he published in a peer-reviewed journal in 2011, showing how a 40 nanosecond burst on a high-powered ultraviolet laser can achieve the very same depth and coloration as we see on the shroud. Wow. And that's really intriguing piece of data.
Yeah.
Now, one thing I didn't mention that is so important to understand about the shroud image is that it is exceedingly superficial. So, in other words,
explain that. Yeah.
So when you look at the shroud, if you Google it or something, the first thing you'll see are all these burns and patches from a fire in 1532. Right. They're very, very prominent. And the image appears to kind of lie in between these two parallel lines, which are nothing more than burns and patches and scorch marks from that fire. Because it was kept in a silver box, the top of the box melted, and the way the cloth was folded, it was folded in 16 layers. And there was a glob of molten silver fell down onto a corner, creating this kind of origami burn pattern.
Oh,
and so that's why it appears the way it does.
Sure.
And it's and so you have all these. So in other words, so if you were to look at the shroud, you'd see that burn pattern. You'd see the water stains from when the fire was doused. You'd see the blood stains. And now, and of course you'd see the image of the man. But if you flip the cloth over, you'll see all that. You'll see the blood, the water stains, the burns, but you will not see the image of the man. The image of the man is a purely superficial phenomenon affecting only the top 1 to 2 microfibers, not threads, microfibers.
Microfibers.
So in other words, each thread is made up of about 200 microfibers. So this image resides on about 1% of a single thread. And this is consistent wherever you look at it. That's the crazy part.
That is crazy.
And so, because you'd think if this was the work of an artist, that you get a little bit more there, a little bit less here, you know, whatever you're using. But that's not what we see. And it's and so it is this extreme superficiality of the image that is probably one of the greatest mysteries of the shroud. And so that's what the physicist in Italy, Apollo Dell'Orazio, he was able to replicate that using that 40 nanosecond burst on a UV laser. And where that gets so cool is because the best explanation for what happened to Jesus in the tomb comes from the Apostle Paul, who writes in 1 Corinthians 15. And verse 52 is not even talking about Jesus. He's talking about you and me. And he says, listen, I tell you a mystery. Yeah. We will not all sleep. That means to remain dead, but we will all be changed. How? In a flash, in a twinkling, in the twinkling of an eye. Yeah. Right? At the last trump, the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will all be changed. So here Paul is talking about an instantaneous transformational event that occurs at the end of the age, but it hasn't happened yet, obviously. But that's exactly what happened to Jesus in the tomb. Now, how do I know that? Because Jesus is called the first fruits of the resurrection. If he's the first fruit, then that means we are the rest of the fruit that comes later at the end of the age. And so if you look at it that way, then we can see that the message of the shroud it has a strong prophetic implication to it.
Absolutely. You're making an excellent point. And this is interesting. And I got a few minutes remaining. But, Russ, You know, the field of archaeology is relatively new in history, and every time we turn the spade in Israel or wherever, it reveals more of what the Bible said was happening. And I see the Shroud of Turin as another piece of this evidence. Why do you think, in your opinion, and you can just, I want to go into your, not only from your expertise in the Shroud, but I want to go into your theology. Why do you think now, at all times, is God showing more evidence of whether it's dealing with Israel, you know, archaeological remains? They didn't believe King David existed, and they found, you know, things that reference the house of David, and they're finding all these things now. Why do you think God's now showing the world, look, here's more evidence, and possibly this is the evidence of the resurrection?
Yeah. I think things come full circle. In other words, you know, Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb, sees that the stone is rolled aside from the entrance, sees that the body's gone, runs to find the apostles, and says, someone has taken our Lord's body out of the tomb, and I don't know where they put him. So Mary thinks the body's been stolen. Now, Peter and John, they run back down to the tomb, and John lets everyone know he got there first, and then Peter gets there. Peter goes straight inside that tomb, sees the linen cloth lying there. Then John goes in. He also notices the cloth lying there and believes. Believes what? Well, believes that he had risen. I mean, this was the rumor that was all through Jerusalem, was a rumor that Jesus himself started, that he would be crucified, he would rise again on the third day. That's why they had the Roman soldiers put in front of the tomb to prevent anyone from stealing the body and claiming a resurrection.
Right.
And so John immediately believed. Now it's curious. It doesn't tell us what he says, but this is important from an apologetic standpoint, is that John becomes the first of the apostles to believe in the resurrection, and that belief is based on the evidence of the linen cloth lying there.
Yeah,
now,
good
that's
point.
significant.
Yeah.
Is because in Acts chapter 1, verse 3, it says, after his suffering, he showed himself to be alive through many convincing proofs. Now, then it goes on to talk about all these post-resurrection appearances.
Yeah.
But the first proof was the linen cloth lying there in the tomb. And we have to ask ourselves, was that only for the benefit of Peter and John, or was it for the whole world throughout all generations? And it's so I think that first witness, the linen cloth itself, is with us even today, because God is not going to leave himself without a witness.
Amen. That is the best point I have ever heard about that. It comes full circle, and here we are seeing the linen cloth that John possibly saw. And so, hey man, I'm a believer, Russ. You have convinced me, that's for sure. And so, hey, how do you have a blog? Do you have a website? How do people find you? I know your book's out there. Is it on Amazon? Tell people how they can get your material.
Well, here's the book. I don't know how well you can see it, but it's, where does it go? Let me put this back. There it is. Shroud Encounter, Explore the World's Greatest Unsolved Mystery. You can buy it on Amazon. You can get it on my website is shroudencounter.com. And it's a lot of other resources there as well. And it's, but the book has a good price point. It's less than $20. And but it's very comprehensive as well. I think you'll enjoy it.
Well, I've enjoyed our talk with you, and I want to bring you on again. I want to plunge a little bit deeper next time into this, and so I'll probably reschedule you here in the near future, my friend. But I appreciate all the work you're doing. You've spent 30 years investigating this, and that blesses us as believers. And you know, you've done the hard work, and here it is as you present it in a very palatable way. And you know, it increases my faith. You know, I don't need all these things. I've already believed in Jesus, obviously, but this is going to help others that struggle, you know, with, well, is there evidence for this? And some people need that. It's an apologetic in many respects.
It is.
You know, and so I think it's cutting edge work that you're doing there, man. And so thank you for the work you're doing.
Thank you too, Brandon. I appreciate it.
All right, man. Well, thank you so much. And folks, thank you again for tuning in. And as always, like the Lord said, when you see all these things begin to happen, like all the evidence of the shroud and what Russ had presented, Look up, lift up your heads, for your redemption draws near. God bless you guys. We'll see you next time. Hey everybody, I need your help, and I need your help in 3 different areas. First of all, I need your help on our channel. Our channel is working against an algorithm, and so we need you to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. And if you'll do that, that helps us get the message out to many people. It outdoes the algorithm that's working against us. So if you'll do those things, real simple, like, subscribe, hit the bell, it'll get our message out to as many people as possible. The second thing you could do to help us out is prayer. We get a lot of pushback online from not only human beings, but from the demonic realm as well. And so we need prayer. And so if you can pray for our ministry, that would greatly help us out. And third, it takes a lot of financial resources to put these programs on. And so we do a lot of filming, with a lot of editing, a lot of going on location. In fact, sometimes we film in Israel, and we film in Turkey and different places like that. And so it takes a lot of money to do these special programs that we put together. And so we need finances. And so if the Lord puts it on your heart to help us, that would be greatly appreciated by us in our ministry. So those are the 3 ways you can help us. Pray to the Lord how you could do that. Real easy. Like, subscribe, hit the bell, pray, and financially support us. God bless you. Thank you so much.